Podcast for the second time, because the first one didn't record, are Edward Clark and Laurie A. Greene. It's the Yoga and the Body is the title of the new book.
That's right.
That's right.
The future of modern yoga in the studio and beyond.
Right, that's the kind of subtext of it. And it's an excellent book. I read it a year ago. Is it out yet?
It is out.
Oh my goodness, look at that. It's Yoga and the Body, the future of modern yoga in the studio and beyond.
Right. So, I mean, to hit it off, I think you give a good definition of yoga at the start of the book. Would you like to go through your definition to set the scene as to what you would define as yoga in the book?
It's the study of self and the study of reality and how those two meld. Something like that.
Because yeah, you happy with that, Laurie?
Yeah, I mean, it's intentionally a very broad definition. And using that broad definition, we have a lot more leeway to talk about things like varying techniques and varying ideas about philosophy and practice.
Yeah. And I mean, it is, I'm not going to say it's irreverential, but it's certainly a very open text in terms of the way that you're approaching yoga. I mean, you consider all the topics, but yeah, I mean, from a very different, a new angle, which really excited me a lot. So I've got a few little points we'll go through. So I thought we'd just have a little whistle-stop tour through the book, as it were. And the first one comes up as Vinyasa and Asana. And you make a good and interesting difference between the difference in moving asana and static asana. So I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Well, I think as far as we can tell, I guess, the main tradition has been this asana as a way to do yoga or physical yoga. And it's premised on an idea of stillness and that one is looking to avoid the distractions that the senses bring to one and to take one's drishti inwards and try and find a foundational reality, some kind of primal reality that is the self, and which is not something that is identified with individual personal characteristics, but is something that is foundational to both self and reality. So asana, in this study of self and study of reality, looks inwardly and seeks to avoid sensual distraction, whereas vinyasa is premised on the self and reality, I guess, being something that is ever changing, and that it is not something that ever comes to a repose, that there's no such thing as a moment in time. There's simply a continuous flow or a version of existence which is simultaneously brought into being and annihilated. So there is not a thing there. There's just this process of flow. And so the business of vinyasa then is this observance of how things change. And this, for the body, in a physical yoga, it's trying to apprehend things through the senses, trying to improve one's understanding of self and understanding of reality through greater embodiment, refinement of the senses, an appreciation of the senses. And there's a very aesthetic quality to what vinyasa consists of. And because it's not trying to avoid reality as something that is other and distracting, it's largely directed outwards. And it's trying to find what reality is like by not looking inwardly, but developing this appreciation of what you can expand into. Ultimately, then, I guess to 13.8 billion light years in every direction, trying to take in the totality in a way that includes this self, mingling with it. Which I think this is what asana is also trying to do by this inward directing.
I think that one of the things that we do throughout the book, I think in all of the chapters, all of the essays, is talk about the sort of rejection of Cartesian duality, and the idea that the body is less important than the mind, and the only way to get into consciousness is directly through the mind and avoiding the body by some method. So in our minds, in all the chapters, the body is what creates consciousness. And assuming that the body's, because the body, we know from embodiment theory that the body creates the self. And if the self is the same as the self, with the big S, the body is the only thing that can create our consciousness. So what we're trying to premise is the idea that we should put the body in the front. We shouldn't, in a physical practice, we shouldn't pretend that our bodies are not important. And in fact, they're not just important, they're central to what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, that puts a nice foundation on the book itself, I'd say. Yeah, that it starts with body-centered. I was going to say before, it's kind of humanistic. I mean, as much as it's not kind of bowing down to any philosophical interpretations of yoga, it's very much kind of about the here and now. I suppose if I was kind of reading through again, that I mentioned the start of the yoga in your definition, and then the end of it, when you say something like the most radical departure yoga could make would be finally to let go of the past and the future, which is, again, a kind of quite a nice kind of way, I think, of rounding up the ideas in your book. That it's like, we're not, I mean, it's respectful of the yoga tradition, but it's definitely questioning the past. And also, looking at what yoga does now, rather than assuming that there's some kind of transcendental future out there that yoga will bring you to. Refreshing. And I think, Laurie, that was a really kind of all the essays hang together with this idea that it is somewhat more about embodiment. So would you suggest that then asana should be more about movement than stasis then? I mean, going back to the original kind of vinyasa asana premise, or can we do both at the same time? Can you look inwards and resolve that outward conflict as well?
I don't think either of them, from their polar positions, could ever succeed. I mean, we find that asana has not produced cities, and I doubt that vinyasa is ever going to produce some kind of saint who can see 13.8 billion light years in every direction. But the things that you would learn through either of them are intriguing, and will not present us. We're finite creatures trying to understand an infinite subject, something with a vastness, both looking inwardly or looking outwardly, that all we can get is interesting perspectives on it. And I mean, again, one of the leitmotifs of the book is that yoga and art share a very similar sort of function in this way, that we don't expect a piece of art to reveal the whole of reality to us, but we can see according to that piece of art and learn from what that perspective gives us. Likewise, if you're doing asana, you're doing a yin practice because you want to find what happens when you finally let go of pain or whatever it is. But you take yourself through an intense experience through which you learn through that perspective. And so, I think in practice, one would like to be able to do both better and better, or to work on it.
Yeah, I think along with that, experience we understand as a process. It's not that it experiences in that moment. So I guess in that way, vinyasa is more attuned. Maybe you could think of vinyasa as more attuned, but not really, because there's small movements going on. You really don't achieve total stillness in doing asana, but just this idea that the process is what matters, and going through that process is where you find that experience, that learning that Ed's referring to. And I think that's really how to look at it, instead of looking at which would be better, to see it all as a process.
Or looking at it in terms of the text, trying to interpret one's experience in terms of old texts, Potentiality, etc. Right? What are we doing here? And it's asked what Potentiality thinks about that. And one chapter, I kind of really think you were re-rendering that idea, or trying to kind of look at how should we interpret our experience. Would you like to talk a little bit more about that, because it definitely is. It's not that you're cutting out all the past texts, but you're certainly saying that, you know, we should equally weigh our present experience alongside anything else that the old sages would have said about yoga previously.
Well, I mean, it's difficult to speculate on what people were actually, what their concerns were 1,000 years ago, or 500 years ago, or 5,000 years ago. We hardly know what the person sitting next to us is thinking. So, to read into the text anything more than your own poetic interpretation of it seems they're not very good fact sort of delivery systems, but they are poetic and rich in what the suggestions that they make. And I think it's, again, you want to look at them, one should look at them like a piece of art. It puts a frame around experience, and you go, oh, okay, well, if I was seeing this according to Potentiality, for instance. I was trying to,
He's generally the one that people refer to. Yeah,
I know. I wanted to just do something classy, like anyway. Never can remember who wrote the Shiva Samhita. Oh yeah, it was Shiva. Yeah.
Well, I mean, we talk a lot about discipline, and how much, discipline is always necessary, right? In any endeavor, and especially in yoga, and it's part of the philosophy of yoga, certainly in the Hatha transcripts, as well as in the Yoga Sutras. But I think the question that we're always looking at when it comes to textual material is, when does that text become so limiting that it's a prison? You make your own prison around it. And these texts, first of all, the Yoga Sutras are sutras. The majority of any Yoga Sutra you're going to read is interpretation. So suggesting that unless we believe this is actually the word, the Shruti, the word of the divine handed down literally, in which case I don't know why we need someone to interpret it, because I guess we would just internalize these things. We have to understand that these things are interpretations, and they are poetic. And who knows what things are metaphors, and what things aren't. So, for example, I can close my eyes and sit in lotus position and imagine that I am levitating, and I'll feel everything I tell yoga students to do when they're sitting. Maybe that's what they were doing. Maybe that's what levitation was. Maybe it wasn't actually, because I've never seen anyone levitate. So
it would be problematic, wouldn't it? Because like the earth would keep moving around, and like they'd run into the wall.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's the way we like to look at the text. You appreciate everything that's come before. And just like bad scientific interpretation or colonialist thinking or Orientalist thinking, right, that has been imposed on yoga in the past by scholars, we can critique those texts, and we can critique the older texts as well. And we should be. I mean, we should, and that's how a discipline evolves. If you don't question, you don't change, and you don't evolve. And there's no real science, if we see yoga as a science, which we do, that can stay alive and healthy without evolving.
I was going to say, would you say that you see yoga as a science? Because it does, I suppose it does come across that idea of looking at yoga now within the current context, rather than deferring to, as I said, any previous ideas of yoga, which most people do. Which it seems an obvious thing, but it does make your book a very different read. As I said a year ago when we did this podcast originally, one of my favorite books that I've read for ages. So please, everyone, do try and purchase it, and you'll enjoy it. I mean, of course it is challenging for some yoga students, because I think everyone wants to believe in some kind of transcendental reality and some kind of deeper esoteric significance around it. But on the other hand, we're looking for meaning in yoga, and we're looking for a meaning. I think anyone would be lying if they said that they didn't care how yoga felt in day-to-day experience. And in that capacity, I think the book gives some marvelous insights as to how to contextualize meaning within the classroom. So I would like to, some of my favorite chapters have been yours around the idea of ritual, as you know, the idea of ritual in yoga classes, and interpreting one's intense experiences and how that might hit. Would you like to talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I think one of the things, the basic change in length of what constitutes a class has lessened the intensity factor. So, I don't know, way back in the 70s, our 2-hour class was like, that was normal, and the teacher was allowed to go on afterwards. And so the experience of the class there was a lot more potency in that. I don't think it's necessarily impossible to make a 45-minute lunch hour ritual between your at your job. That might be a possible thing to do, but time has lessened the amount of ritual that is happening in people's normal practice. So it means things like the 5-day intensive or 3-day workshop has evolved into the forum where that's where the deeper work can go on, or making a pilgrimage to Mother India kind of thing. These become
the meaningful experiences that they're looking for. In those longer type sessions.
Even in the class situation, I think you make a really interesting point is the classes are, just walking into a yoga class rather than, necessarily it needs to be a long-term endeavor. Just walk into a yoga class and all the ideas that you make about the idea that it is a ritual in the very first place, I think struck me interestingly, because there's loads of little details, in different styles. Ashtanga has its little things, put the fingers together, you mentioned, I think. The water bottle always struck me. Why do people need the water bottle for their legs so much? It's one posture, just get over it, don't need to put those arms through the knees. But then, understanding the little rituals around it and seeing them within that framework, I started to say, yes, of course, this is what we're lacking, in modern society so much. It's funny how yoga's become so popular at the very same time when we've lost all social rituals of contextualizing ourselves amongst other people. It almost seemed like a shoe-in then, an open door to yoga to walk through. So that's one of my favorite parts of your book is looking at this class situation of yoga as a ritual, and expanding our meaning individually and within a group setting. So, anything you could say around that, I'd love to hear more about that. Yeah,
the context. When we think about what ritual is, right? Why is it the rituals attracting people, like you're saying, and there's no question that a class is a ritual, right? We have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and rules for starting and transitioning through the practice and then ending it in Shavasana. It's obvious we have the accoutrements of a ritual in the space, the context of the studio space, whether it's incense or music or iconography or statues or whatever, right? The lights dimming. We take off our shoes, we're barefoot, which you're never allowed anywhere inside, etc. Right? We could go over all these millions of different aspects that make it ritual. So we agree it's a ritual, right? But the context of the ritual is when we're talking about the effect of something, the context is actually more potent for creating the effect, the context in which you're enacting whatever you're doing, than what you're actually doing, right? So it doesn't really matter what you're doing physically in the yoga practice, so much as the context provides the venue for interpreting that, and each person's going to get a different interpretation. But the teacher, let's say in the studio or the studio itself, is going to set up that studio to try to create a certain kind of experience for people. And that's good. And this one of the weaknesses that we've talked about, and that's in the book actually briefly, with online teaching. One of the difficulties with it, everyone's in their living room or their kitchen, where they pushed aside the chairs, and they're trying to create a context, a ritual context that you'd get at a studio where all these things are controlled for you.
Sounds like the yoga police are coming for us.
I know. Yeah. If we don't manage to edit that bit out, that's a loud siren here in Poland. Yeah, the yoga police are indeed coming for us. I mean, well, let's keep that bit in. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I absolutely love this part of the book and the way that you kind of then feel in a sense there is a responsibility of the teacher themselves, but also how much can we keep that ritual setting open then for people to have an experience which they can then translate in the way that they want, or how much should the teacher then contextualize that meaning in a certain way, right? There's just a lot more lucidity there when we really think about what's going on, and which is, again, going back to the genius of your book, that it just makes you really think about what's actually going on in the class, rather than thinking that I'm just trying to chitter-vritty narodaha my mind. Like there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on here, right? And you also mentioned the intensity of emotions and experiences, and I think you kind of make some interesting comparisons to how that might actually affect the memory regarding changing kind of patterns as well. Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Yes. I mean, in when we have an emotionally intense occurrence in our life, these will tend to create memory. So, because it was emotionally intense. So it accounts for current sort of interest in extreme flexibility, extreme inverted work. It just makes it seem more meaningful because something important happened. The body is inclined to remember things that are significant in that way. But especially, I mean, one of the curious effects of this, I think, has been, just relating it back to the ritual before, is that the context of the ritual being a place where important events happened has lent itself very strongly to the community concept. So you having this strong ritual builds community, often at the expense of the study of yoga. That it doesn't, the actual doing of the yoga per se is, that's just our excuse. We're doing these extreme things using postures or vinyasa to make our community happen this way. And so that gets prioritized over what the actual exploration of self and reality would be, except in the context, myself belongs with all these others. And so, it's, I don't know, I mean, again, from the late 70s to today, I would say there's been quite a change from, it used to be about transcendence or transformation. They still are important buzzwords, but community as the thing that really holds yoga together has, I mean, you can't go to a website without seeing it mentioned about, we really value our community, and fair enough. What's the yoga's role in that? I don't know if you've got anything to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, just the practicing with other people. I mean, just by virtue of breathing with other people, hearing them breathe is a very emotional, it certainly can evoke emotion. Students, I know my students, and as students talk about, and in our research, students talk about that feeling of everyone breathing together, like we're all here for the same reason, and how emotionally supportive that is. And these people are always, they're not judging me. It's just all about this sort of positive uplifting of one another. And I think that that's become a more important thing in many ways than the actual personal endeavors in practice. And what's causing this is another discussion.
Do you think yoga's overbalanced in that manner then? That it's kind of swing to a hyper-socialization?
I think popular yoga is, yeah. I think, if we're talking about serious practitioners, and I don't, want to get into what serious is. I don't know if I can define that, but I think popularized yoga, what most people are going to, I think it's all, again, look at the websites. Find a website that doesn't talk about community, up front, as highlight community is something they offer. That's their main offering, is community. Then we have to think about what we're actually trying to do in yoga. Maybe we're trying to create
somewhat at the expense of the individual then.
Or of other endeavors like higher pursuits, more more austere pursuits or more complex pursuits about the nature of reality. If it's just about feeling like you belong and people support you, I guess we'd have to give up something else, wouldn't we?
What used to be a solitary pursuit, we presume, is not something that many people really do alone.
Yeah, I mean, the reason that yogis didn't marry and left their families and all their relations is because those were just, ties to the material world. Now it's all about tying ourselves to other people and institutions. That's what we're aiming for when we go to practice.
But like the asana vinyasa polarity, why does it have to be one or the other? Right? Mm-hmm. One should be able to have a significant solitary kind of practice, and one should be able to do yoga with a group and recognize that they're not necessarily going to have the same result, though they might. But the experience of either of them is significant, and finding how to make either of them intense is what makes, I think, for a better understanding of the nature of reality and self. But sometimes intensity is found in the very subtle. It's not just getting the even bigger splits by putting my heels up on a block, or the deepest back bend ever. Of course, those are going to have they're meant to have a profound experience. That's why people get into doing ever more difficult, more painful, more extreme things, because the buzz with it is a fascinating thing that teaches about the self.
And just in general, in terms of our critiques or discussions, however you want to look at them in this book about all these things, whether it's community or the text or whatever, we're not saying anything's wrong. We're just asking people to be aware of what they're doing and question what they're doing and think about what they want to get out of this practice. And if they want to get whatever they want to get, then they need to act in a way, they need to practice in a way that's going to get them to achieve that. And we also want them to be, ambitious, a little more ambitious than it makes my back feel better. Or I would like that. So maybe, but, we're not saying anything's wrong, but we are asking you to question all of these things. We certainly are doing that.
Mm-hmm. And what would you say to the critique that you're not really, you're kind of shooting down holy cows, or that it's not really a devotional perspective on yoga, or irreverence, or how would you answer that?
What could be more reverent than looking at yoga as a way to achieve awe? And we're actually wanting people to go to those transcendent places.
Absolutely. The intensity is to be found in the nature of reality, is that it's not boring. It's every bit of the flow is fascinating. One should be a superb appreciator of who one is and an appreciator of what the nature of reality is. Not to be said, of course you can do that through community. Why not? You could become a community specialist, as maybe some people are. That's what they're trying to achieve. Something is sacrificed. The solitary pursuit of yoga would be sacrificed for that alone. But I think we're just advocates of the intense is to be found, the awe-inducing is to be found in the very small and the very large.
Yeah, and that once you can, just look at a piece of dust on your table and be as awe-inspired as looking at a sunset, I think you're there. We want to make the extraordinary and the ordinary have the same effect. And to me, that's yoga. That's a yoga mindset, right? To experience something so fully that you don't have to be a thrill seeker to get that kind of a rush, right? You don't have to jump out of an airplane. I'm a little bit of that kind of a person, so I can speak to that a bit, but it'd be better if I could do that just waking up and looking around me. And so that's the kind of shift that we're looking to see. We're wanting people to say, okay, it does make my back feel better. Yeah, it has relieved my stress. Yes, it has made me like myself more, whatever these sort of quotidian sort of, goals that people have achieved. But then we're asking them,
where else
can you take this? Yeah.
Where does God relate to this? I mean, obviously, before 20th century, yoga was understanding God, right, or communing with God. Or, it was very much front and center, and now, perhaps, as you say, community has become front and center. Would you position, would you position God anywhere in the text?
I mean, it depends how you want to define God, right? I mean,
I
if
knew
you
you were going to say that.
If you want to
I'm
define
just going to give you
God
a caveat. Yeah.
as something, as a Christian God, then it's not in the text. If you want to define God as the Hindu God in the text, if you want to define God as this some essence that's larger than me that I'll never be able to grasp, but I am striving to understand because it makes me feel, again, that sense of awe. It takes me out of my ordinary and lets me understand, like when I look through the Hubble telescope, that how ridiculously insignificant I am. So why wouldn't I want to look outside of me? Then God's in the text.
That was tactfully answered. Yeah, I mean, I think we would find. Oh my God, your leg is crept into the frame. I mean, I'm just thinking back to when I first studied yoga. It was love was the thing. It wasn't God. It was, it was the hippies. Love is everywhere, man. Love, and that it was just God or love, and for me, I would say it's beauty. And it's not initially my idea, stealing that from Ananda Kumaraswamy, but yeah, I just think the nature of reality is beauty. But if you wanted to call that God or you wanted to call that love, that would be okay. I guess we're all talking about the same. The extraordinary, that which induces awe in both the mundane and the obviously extreme. So, yeah, but I guess why it doesn't really crop up much is the idea of worship doesn't seem to fit well into, I guess, where the modern yoga concerns lie.
Well, not yours in terms of kind of allying yoga and science together. Worship generally doesn't go well with science. I'm sure there's a
science usually wins.
I'm sure there's an argument against that, but generally it seems that way. I mean, the text does expand or go into a lot of conflations and a lot of yoga myths. I wonder if any other yoga myths or conflations come to the tip of your tongue, because you do mention many kind of wellness aspects of the one particular one I like in terms of wellness aspects, how the conflation of the person's good looks and their spiritual prowess tend to be easily segued together. The better looking they are in terms of the asana, the more spiritual they must be, which it seems so obvious. Again, it's not true. It's not true. No, I don't think it is. I'm not sure. But looking on, it's easy to get that perspective, right? Because the mind kind of plays a trick on you, right? Yeah.
Well, I guess sort of going along
just one
with
example.
We also there is an assumption that what we see in the body is actually what's going on inside. That the body doesn't lie. That the body is the mind. It's just, and it's what we read of it. And so in a sense, a 22-year-old who studied gymnastics till she was 16 and then took up yoga and did a 200-hour training and now, is really popular at the gym. Many people see that as, oh yes, she's young and healthy and, she's really obviously really flexible. Ergo, the thing that doesn't go along with that, which should have been, yes, she's a 22-year-old who studied gymnastics till she was 16 and, and she's just young, and that's what's there. What you see is that. Instead, it's equated with this spiritual attainment. My God, she can do the splits. She must be so liberated. She must be so free. That there is, and liberation, I suppose, in all senses of that. It's, yeah, there's a freedom there, such as only the young can have. These would be the crazy presumptions that would go along. Yeah, so the people see a 22-year-old and equate that with advanced spirituality. that she must be liberated because she's very flexible, and they assume that the way the body looks reveals their projection of what they think should be inside, rather than the body reveals exactly what the person is. She's a 22-year-old who studied gymnastics and has that flexibility. It doesn't show a great liberated spiritual being.
Yeah, so I was going to ask a question about the floating signifiers, and how the language around yoga might be refined or expose certain myths that we are taking for granted in the yoga world, perhaps.
Yeah, it's interesting you ask about that chapter, because that chapter we had probably the most trepidation about, because we knew we weren't going to do a complete real linguistic study, and we didn't want it to seem like we were trying to do that. We just wanted to point out that our language is both a reflection of who we think we are, of our identity as yogis and the yoga community, whether it's the studio, the person, or the worldwide yoga, right, or a discipline of yoga, particular discipline. But it also, is meant to impact the way we think about what we're doing and what we're talking about. So it affects us, the kind of language that we use. It's all language does that, right? So, but it's necessary that we're aware of that in the yoga community when we use words, and we brought up especially the floating signifiers, and these are words that sort of everyone knows what it means, but they could never define it for you.
Liberation being
right, or yogic. Something's yogic,
That's really
yoga
yogic.
lifestyle.
Your observation is so yogic there,
and so it allows, because it doesn't really mean anything, like energy, for example. Energy doesn't really mean anything. It can mean a lot of things. It's a conflation of so many ideas, right? Because it doesn't really mean anything. It's open. It can mean anything, right? It always works,
well, you see, that's what happens when you do the work. When you do the work, Laurie, the work does it for you.
Right. And if you haven't done the work, then you probably are not dedicated to the practice either. Right. So these kinds of ways of speaking both let us know that you're part of the community. They signal, a person signals that they're a serious yogi because they know these words. But it's also, it sort of hinders what we're doing, because you never actually think about what you mean by the practice, or critique what the practice means, or what energy is and what it can actually do, because everyone knows it. It's energy. It's energy, man.
And it's the practice. Just there's this idea, I suppose, that let the practice do the work. That and that also, and I've come across this in my work as well, which is rather, let's say, thoughtful. That there's a magic in the practice, and if you talk about it too much, and if you try to kind of look at it, in a critical framework too much, that you'll kind of get rid of that magic. Yeah. What do you say about that? You just practice. I mean, the classic practice and all is coming kind of idea, without putting too much mind in it. That we're already too much in our mind, and that we really need to get into our bodies and not into our minds more.
I think the distinction that we make in that chapter is there's a difference between the practice and my practice, right? So my practice is what I'm doing, what I do, in a classroom or every day at home or whatever. The practice is more, that's erudite, right? That is larger than myself. And that's what I'm trying to attain is the practice. It has a different sense, or a different magnitude, right? And importance when I say the practice or the work, as compared to my practice or my work. I don't think it's really about, and this is a question for Ed really, it's really about this idea of rationalizing it, more than recognizing that when we say things like the practice, it makes us, when I say the practice, people read it differently than your practice or the Ashtanga practice. It has a different sense to it, right?
Yes. And that's exactly what I have to say about that.
I thought you might launch into some rationality issues, because the difference between reason and rationality is really in that as well.
I was hoping you would deal with it. Well, I mean, sometimes it is useful to have a floating signifier and just go, yeah. Well, we're talking about liberation here. And we agree, part of the agreement in that would be that we all have a different version of what that means, and it is a large question, and that's a reasonable way to look at it. To be
also
rational,
somewhat the ambiguity of it is the ambiguity of it that kind of allows one to expand into something, just like the floating signifier of the Asana itself allows one to project all kinds of things onto it in a way that they then might be explored, that it is open-ended in the very first place.
And the problem with rationality that Laurie's trying to make me talk about is that it nails things down. It says this is exactly what it means. And this is, I mean, just going back to earlier stuff about ancient textual material, there's a bit of a tyranny in rationality in that once it's set forever. And this is why a lot of people, I think, go back to the ancient text, because they can say these words do not change. My experience of yoga as a 30-year-old is different than my experience as a 70-year-old. And that has changed, and that can't be right. Not if we're trying to find something that is more deep and foundational. So there's this trust of the word, or the thing which can be categorically stated and will not change. God, the yoga police again. I mean, what's useful in the floating signifiers is that they allow you to make reasonable statements that are very big, that you don't have to actually justify completely. They're meant to be interpreted, and the ambiguity, the equivocal nature of it is what makes poetry great. Poetry is not like just a code to say something that could have been said more easily with fewer words and and less rhyme or less meter or whatever. It's their floating signifiers are useful, but they're also kind of stupid sometimes. That they just allow people to not be sufficiently interrogative. Is that really a word?
It should be.
I think it is a word.
Yeah.
I think there is this kind of creative tension between precision and the allowance of something else to creep through the cracks. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about Samkhya, where Samkhya philosophy being very precise and really trying to nail down reality, and also Samkhya philosophy really being the underpinning of yoga philosophy, and how you probably give a little definition of Samkhya first of all, so people know what we're talking about, and then how you might creatively reinterpret that, if you can do to fit the modern yoga class.
30 pages in the first book. The worst, most difficult chapter of our. Really generalizing here, it posits two categories of reality. One that is the material world, where stuff exists, and the nature of stuff, a piece of wood, is that it doesn't actually stay the same. It always changes. So a piece of wood was a tree 500 years ago, and then somebody chopped it down and it got built into a house, and the house burnt down and the ashes scattered into the field and some grass grew out of that. That's the nature of Prakriti, is that it's stuff that is ever changing. And then Kapila posits this other, at least we assume he posited another category of reality called Purusha. And the nature of this Purusha thing, commentators call it things like pure consciousness, and its nature is not changeability. It is something that is everlasting, eternal, indestructible, unchanging, and cannot be apprehended by the realm of Prakriti. So even the most refined kinds of materiality, such as thoughts, interrogative work in the brain, would not be able to actually apprehend pure consciousness, that they are remote from one another. And but through deep searching inwardly, one can maybe find a foundational big S self, which is this pure consciousness. All right, so that would have been the rationale for doing yoga in a way where you sat completely still, so you weren't distracted by this outer world where everything changes and is always ever changing. And I mean, of course, the Vinyasa thing is they want to look at that. And we didn't take heat, but the yoga police came down a little heavy on us on not being happy with that version of Purusha. And again, like I said earlier in this, it's very difficult to know what somebody living in the 6th century BCE was actually thinking about in their contemplative pursuits. So in just accepting this idea of pure consciousness, another category of reality, for the modern yogi needs a little bit of, well, what do we know about, where has science or art led us in looking at this?
Yeah, also just experientially, the idea of yogaing yourself into oblivion really doesn't appeal to me anyway. I mean, yeah, that you reduce everything down to a pure monad that exists independent of any experiencing and independent of any relation to anything, and you, I assume, feel nothing at all and don't have any nescience, don't have any consciousness whatsoever. I don't really feel that would be a justifiable aim for me anyway. Like it sounds a bit like a kind of yogic suicide. I've joked before, but yeah,
exactly. It is dying to be born again. But I think we've come up with this idea that Purusha, to satisfy some of these clauses of it's indestructible, everlasting, it's better to think of it as potentiality. That it is something that doesn't actually exist in the material realm, but which is demonstrably real. These possibilities could happen, and some of them are more remote than others. But there's a third category, which is things that could never happen. So those don't actually get into the Prakriti or Purusha. They're not things that could happen. I'm not going to turn into a ping pong bat in the next 30 seconds. That doesn't exist in Purusha. But, I might, go scratch my head, and that was something that existed there. And so it could happen. Didn't have to happen, but it existed in potentiality. There are objections to that. Some Samkhyists might say that it's sort of a Mahaprakriti, the things that are the actual genesis is, or this sort of Mula Prakriti. It's the things, it's a possible terminology for that. But I think as a starting place for things that are actually reasonable, that might give us delight in this life, this idea of potentiality has some use in terms of the study of self and the study of reality, that you're studying a reality that doesn't actually exist but which could exist, and it has effects on the self. What are the aspects of self that are lying there in potentiality? So, and then okay, is that the same as what Kapila meant by Purusha? Probably not, but who's to say? Because 2,500 years ago, that was those were the terms he used. Are we going to just go, okay, well, somebody then, an interpreter of it, said it means pure consciousness? Well, then what is pure consciousness? We can't describe it with words because those are prakriti. So how useful is it to us as a concept? Are we, what's being delivered in terms of understanding self and reality by having this category that's just pure consciousness, which even that can't be a good description because that's a word description. Right. So I don't know, in the chapter on metaphors and myths, we point out that, okay, well, a lot of this pure consciousness is used, imagery of light is used extensively in yoga. And okay, so yeah, we're light on yoga. But as we point out, the nature of darkness is also very suggestive of gravitas and the unknown and the stuff which potentially has intensity in it as well. So anyway, that's how our modern interpretation of Samkhya, at least those aspects of Samkhya.
I think one of the reasons that we came to that sort of understanding of Samkhya, or description of Samkhya for the use in the text, is that I think we can safely say that what most people are looking for if they're doing yoga for anything above exercise, right? Anything more than exercise, is they're looking for a meaning, some sort of meaning in their lives. They want to know, who am I? And they're
Exactly.
trying to figure out, who am I in comparison, by distinguishing myself from everything else I see and feel around me and things I might not see. So
and
maybe
also in relation to everyone else as well.
Whatever. Think of Purusha as that's the ultimate endpoint of that search. What is possible in this world? What is the myriad of things that can exist in this world, and how do I fit into that? I think it's a much better definition for yoga, and I don't think that the ancients were looking for anything different. I just think, because why wouldn't they? I mean, isn't this sort of a universal human condition that we find in every culture and every religion and every belief system? Is, why the hell are we here, and who are we? And what's our purpose? Being that that's a universal question that we see throughout time, I don't see why we wouldn't suspect that that was the question they were asking. And this was the technique that they came up, the discipline they came up with. And maybe discipline's a better word than science, because it's broader, and it can be more interpretive, right? Outside of rationality, to include the reason as well. And that's why that definition of Purusha, I think, works better in our analysis.
Yeah. And our time, the culture that it's happening in.
Along which lines, at one point you mentioned the rejection of Western culture for spiritual insights. Do you kind of feel that the way that we're approaching yoga is some kind of kickback against Western culture and modernism and the difficulties and stresses that it's bringing upon us? But
I think that all of the sort of alternative medicine and alternative health and all of our, and certainly yoga is part of that wellness community, in worldwide wellness community. I think that entire community is about rejection of some science, some scientific ideas and principles and vaccines and Western medicine and Western ideas that are seen as colonialist. This whole idea of decolonizing yoga, meaning taking the Western influence out of it. And the science is all part of that, layered into that. So there's always been an anti-science bias. And I think it wanes and ebbs and flows, how much of that bias is popular. And it's different between different individuals as well. But I certainly think it's there. And on the other hand, of course, we love to use science to prove our alchemical ideas. So, I'm all about going, oh, don't go to a doctor, do this. But then, I'll also say to you why, they did a study of yoga therapy that told me that it fixed my back. So I'll use science to justify why my non-scientific practice, right, is as good as science. I'll use science. So we use it when it's convenient. But I think there is a general distrust, let's put it that way, of science along with a lot of other Western ideas.
It's funny because it sits in a sort of paradoxical way with this idea that Laurie said earlier, the yoga could just be about fitness or stress reduction, or and that was seen as a very low level thing. But that is the stuff that can be scientifically justified. We can check the cortisol levels here when people have meditated for an hour once a week for 6 weeks, and so science is used to justify these very, what we're calling sort of low level interests. And one of the things about the book is we're saying, let's that stuff is good, but what are these other more transcendent or ephemeral things, the ambitious goals that yoga could be looking at as well?
And science will never be able to experimentally test or prove. And so, how can we get to those questions as well? So we can't just rely on science, right? That's why we make yoga akin to art, that it's, it has that closest relationship.
And yet at the same time, strongly interrogate the ridiculous, like to the wellness community being the example of the ridiculous here. But if people make bizarre claims about how yoga cured my cancer, there has to be a reason. There is a mechanism by which it does work. So if that's the kind of claim you're going to make, but I think it's more the area of awe and ecstasy and the experiential extremes. These are some of the things that are only partly addressed in yoga right now, which are part of this future of yoga in the studio and beyond. That it's like, how do we more regularly access the ecstatic, or how do we give ourselves an intensely lived experience? What role can yoga actually have in this, if any? And I mean, it certainly has in the past. It has been something that has, was its major concern.
The emphasis on experience as opposed to analysis, and again, we're not throwing away analysis, but the emphasis on experience is very important. And also, along with that, it gets the responsibility on the practitioner instead of looking for some guru or the next best system that I want to practice to get me there. That's what we're trying to take people away from. We're not saying that disciplines suck. I love so many different kinds of practices, or that dedicating yourself to one is wrong. What we're saying is, don't rely on that discipline to do it. This is your responsibility. This is a personal venture.
Don't rely on the practice.
That's right. It's got to be coming from your experience, and that is only you can have. The practice can have the experience for you.
Yeah, the emphasis on self-responsibility definitely comes through, as does both of your humour. In the book is kind of sardonic and funny at many points. I mean, just to finish, which is always the case with you, Ed. Anyway, and knowing your humour. So anyway, finally, I want. Yeah. Well, I don't know Laurie so well, but I know that you always are, joking around with me.
I'm funnier.
So, I mean, you're funnier. You're funny. Okay, we'll meet you one day as well, and we'll find out. So, what about the last part of the book when you mention the tacit unworthiness of the yoga premise in the first place? And I really like that idea. I often kind of feel I'm battling against this idea. You come to class to be purified, either for the teacher, as you mentioned. Perhaps the teacher will do that for you by adjusting you into the right position, right? That we're inherently kind of wrong, and we need the yoga to kind of put us right. And the whole yoga industry kind of rests on this kind of parity between our wrongness and our need for salvation. So we're back in the same old clothes as we were 100 years ago, right? We're guilty until proven innocent. We're sinning, and we need to somehow purify ourselves to be okay in the eyes of others and both ourselves. You want to just say something on that? Maybe Ed's laughing now. He's going to finish up on this.
Well, no, it's absolutely no. It's so true. I don't know. Just thinking about an incident last night, just people talking about, how you can use this experience to heal, and really you let it into yourself, into your heart, and you welcome it to heal you, and you have to ask it what you're going to. But what if you didn't really feel like you needed healing? What if you just went, I'll do this experience because it's going to be fun. Mm-hmm. This is going to be interesting. The premise that we do yoga, that everybody is somehow broken. And all it does, if you sell yoga like that, is you attract a lot of broken people. And so it just gets reaffirmed that, I'm broken, she's broken, he's broken, we're all broken, and oh my God, I've got so much toxicity since then. I just need to really get myself out of that, and yoga helps me. And, okay, so it might be fine. Yoga, why not be a healing modality? Because the placebo effect works, yoga is going to heal me. And for whatever reasons, the placebo worked again. But what if somebody's actually fundamentally healthy? Then what can they do with yoga? What sort of places do you take people who are who can think, who enjoy themselves, and what can they do with this? What do they make with it? I think one of the suggestions, kind of where we led with the podcast here, is that art and yoga share a lot of similar territory, and it's curious that yoga hasn't made a step in applying its techniques to create something that exists outside of the studio. It's like if there was no such thing as ballet performances, theaters, and people still studied ballet and they learned ballet and they had all these brilliant technical moves, but they never performed because there was no such thing. Or they wrote plays, but there was no such thing as a theater, so they never, they can do brilliant things with these words, but they never get performed. And yoga is in this place where you've got extraordinary practitioners. I mean, the level of physical ability in yoga today is truly extraordinary. I mean, there's never been an era like this. I can't see how there could have been, where you've got 60-year-olds learning to do handstands, and fabulous sort of barriers have been broken in terms of what is potential. And then they don't use it for anything because there's no real utility in the yoga postures. I mean, you can use Trikonasana to pick a coin up off the street if you find one, but you're never going to have to do a big back bend. Never going to have to do that. It's just, and the high arch maybe to get up to the top shelf, but there's no mundane utility. So there has to be, if you're going to study yoga and get so good at it, you can do these amazing things. Maybe that's enough just in itself to go and do your hour or 45 minutes or even 2 hours of really amazing things. And then you don't ever do it again. I'm thinking part of the future is finding new utility for what the amazing things are. And part of this is it's not just the demonstration of these things, it's the refinement of one's ability to appreciate what the nature of reality is, that whatever it is that you get out of that big back bend, well, there better be something so extraordinary in it that it's worth experiencing and remembering how to get there again and again, because it brings joy with it, or bliss, or ananda.
I think what Ed's talking about is what we're really looking at, in a sense, is an expanded idea of human potential. That when we usually when people say, "Oh, I take it off my mat and into the world," not to designate any particular person, but this idea of taking off mat, they mean I go do good deeds somewhere, which is completely the idea being, I guess, that I do my physical practice and that transforms me in a way that I am a better person, and now I go do things. But there's no direct connection between the physicality and the action that I'm asked to do off of the mat, right?
So you could just cut out doing the waste of time with the yoga practice and just be
things. A good person. Yeah, be nice. But what we're saying is, look at what my body, again, the body is the driver. The body's the driver. That is really the difference in what we're saying, I think, the emphasis we have compared to other analyses. But what can all these amazing things I can do with my body, how can I push this? And the Hatha yogis were doing this too. They were looking at what can my body take? Now, they did it to lose their body, right? To say, I don't need this thing. But another way to look at it, and that's fine, do it that way if you want, but recognize it's about the body, right? And then that makes sense. What they were doing off of their mats makes sense, right? Or off of their tiger rugs or whatever, makes sense. But what can I do with my body in a way to first appreciate and understand the potential that I have in my body? And of course, that includes everything, not just my muscles and bones. It includes my fortitude and my perseverance and my diligence and all that stuff. And what does that tell me about the nature of humanity and the nature of reality? I mean, that's the kind of connection we're looking for off the mat.
And I think what's interesting is that it's taken, 140 years since Vivekananda, or 130, but this sort of post-Vivekananda thing where he was denigrating the body, essentially going, no, this is about Patanjali meditation. This is physical stuff is just preamble to get, but
or
actually,
a corruption of what it is.
And actually, it's taken this long to go through whatever processes that involved to get to a place where we can go, well, maybe it is more back like the tantrics or the hatha yogis, where maybe the body is not something to be despised, but it's a tool, in their case, to achieve enlightenment, or in our case, endarkenment, or but it is there, and can't be denied. That pretending to deny it is kind of that. Why? That has it where the results this might deliver. And I mean, Vivekananda, of course, was trying to well, God knows what do I know about the contemplative pursuit, but he was.
I think he was trying to meet the West where we were, I suppose, with a Cartesian dualism, really, and kind of vilifying the body was an easy way to do it, since we were speaking to a Victorian public who weren't really, very somewhat keen, at least in public, weren't keen on the body. No, I love what you're saying about this, and the performative aspect of yoga. I just kind of reflect upon, if there was a little bit more yoga performance, then maybe the yoga room itself might be a little bit less performative, in a way that there is that need to express. And we look at the early. I mean, I think of the first time that yoga came over to the UK. I was reading a book by someone, oh God, I forget his name now, recently, and he was suggesting that actually the first performance of yoga in the UK was actually in the late 1800s at the London Aquarium, and it was a yoga performance.
London
before
Aquarium.
Before anyone did a yoga class.
Yeah. Oh, froze there.
Yeah, froze. Okay.
Yeah.
Back. Yeah.
All right, back. Okay.
The London Aquarium.
Yeah.
The yogi who came thinking he was going to give a demonstration of deep philosophic principles, and people just came and paid 50p or whatever to see the stretchy man. Very, very depressing.
And of course, Iyengar, did yoga performance as well, right? I mean, he was, along with a doctor,
was a big part of Ashtanga,
Yeah.
Until recently.
Yeah, I mean, but
there is something to it.
Circles us sort of around to what we were talking about in the beginning, which is meaning making. Because the only way that we make meaning is through our bodies, right? And we make it better through the ritual action in our bodies. And seeing the studio work maybe as, I'll say this because I know how much Ed likes rehearsal, as opposed to performing. The studio work is like, what if we did look at it as rehearsal for something bigger off the mat? What if we look, whatever that is, it doesn't have to be performing physical yoga. It could be doing something else. What if we did look at that as that rehearsal space? And then I agree with you. I don't think people would be as performative. They wouldn't be all like, "What does that look good? Who's looking at me?" Or, "Oh, I usually get that posture." They would just be doing their work, and that they'd actually be discovering things that you can't discover while you are preoccupied with
preening.
Yeah, whatever. do how you look in the mirror, or what somebody in front of you is doing, or whether or not you're up to snuff at that moment. But just being in it for that experience, because it is the rehearsal. It is the way that you gain. It's where all the work happens. The performance isn't where the work happens, right? It's in the rehearsal where the work happens.
So is there anything else that you might say to just round up this book, if anyone was kind of somewhat intrigued to read more? How would you pitch it? Because I really want everyone to read this, because I've loved this book, and I've read it a second time now, and I've equally loved it. So is there anything else you could say to whet people's appetites anymore, so we get people to read this book?
I read it, and I'm surprised myself that it's really good. It actually makes some really interesting observations, and it's no humility here. I'm blooded with some of it, and I go, geez, I want to steal that. Oh no, I wrote that.
Yeah.
So, because it's, some of it is like, oh my God, that's really smart. And I think the last chapter, we were discussing that just before coming on here, the idea about how yoga has been turned into a self-policing prison system. I think there's some fascinating sort of observations about what to do next. In our summary of where yoga is at now, we point some of what the possibilities are, where the potentiality lies for yoga in the future, which is that we don't speak that much about the future, and it's the whole book is about where can we take yoga now with this starting place, what are the possibilities?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the reason we love this book so much is this is like the culmination of maybe, I don't know, over 20 years of Ed and I just arguing with each other, over drinks or food or, and so.
She always takes the big one.
So, but it really is the sum total of us having some pretty deep and not so deep discussions over the years. And there's a lot of that in it. I think that why someone would want to read it is, and we'd love to make yoga that kind of a discipline again. It used to be like that, where we would just sit around and just argue, all of us, we're our age, about stuff and talk about where the discipline's going and what could do and who's doing what. And I would love for that to happen again. And I think a reason a practitioner might want to read this book is what we're really saying is the future of yoga isn't in the hands of Patanjali or the next big guru or the next celebrity teacher. The future of yoga is in the hands of the practitioners. You're going to be the change if you want to be. You're going to be those people that get to create and take this further. And that's what I think the usefulness, the main usefulness for the practitioners. This is a book for practitioners. It's not a teacher training book. It's not a book for, academics necessarily. Certainly we didn't write it for that purpose, even though there's academics in it. It's a book for practitioners. People that just anybody, we like to say anybody that's ever gotten out of class and gone, I feel like I'm missing something. Like, what else could I get here? That's what this book is about, and that's who it's for. And so that's why they should read it.
That's it. Yeah, exactly that feeling. Like, yeah, there's a lot, there's just something more about this experience that I could get my teeth into. Exactly that feeling, Laurie. You put your finger on it. Yeah, and anyone can read this. I mean, in some points it is, it is quite complex in terms of the ideas it discusses, but totally readable for any person that wants to approach it and pick it up. So please do. Thanks, Ed and Laurie, for coming on again. Let's hope our internet connection is preserved somewhat, and we have a good recording to show to everyone. Thanks for coming on, guys. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Adam.
Thanks.
Bye.
Cheers.